Hello, this is chapter 9. This chapter is entitled Mountain Men. Okay, as we get into chapter 9, one English observer wrote, America seems to be breaking up and moving westward. Not everybody, but many people want to move out to the west. And remember, west is going to change as we talk over a period of time. At first, west meant just to the east side of the Appalachian Mountains. Now west means just past the Appalachian Mountains and all the way to the Mississippi River. By the time we get done with this chapter, west means all the way over to the west coast of North America. By the 1820 census, there were Americans living across the Mississippi River. In 1810, 1 out of 7 people had lived west of the Appalachian Mountains. In 1820, 1 out of 4 Americans. And by 1840, 1 out of 3 Americans are living between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. So if you think about 1840, 1/3 of Americans are moving or are living between the Appalachians and the Mississippi River. If you think about this area between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains, by 1840, 1/3 of them are living west of the Appalachian Mountains. Okay, why were so many people moving west? Well, we have, first of all, a population explosion. Between 1800 and 1820, we go from a population of about 5.3 million people to 9.6 million people. In 1830, we have a population of 13 million. In 1840, we have a population of 17 million. Now, cities were able to absorb some of this population growth, but not all of it. And remember, most people are still farmers. The vast majority of Americans are not living in cities yet. They are living in rural areas. There's economic pressures in the cities. It's oftentimes hard to find a job. If you do have a job, then a lot of times those jobs are very low paying. And so if you own your own land, you can be self-subsistent. You can live on your own. You can grow your own food. You can run your own life. And this is a very American idea, this idea of total independence, this idea of self-sufficiency. Land is considered cheap. In 1815, land sales in the United States in just that year alone was about 1 million acres. In 1819, land sales were about 5 million acres. Now, something that we should pay attention to is how are these people buying land? And for the most part, people are buying land because they are getting cheap and easy loans, which we're going to cover here in just a little bit. The land law of 1800, we're going to have a series of land laws. There's a land law in 1800. The minimum purchase was 320 acres, which for most farmers is going to be way too much land. And the price was about $2 an acre. By 1804, a land law of 1804 dropped the minimum acres to 160 acres for a price of $1.64 an acre. And the land law of 1820 drops the minimum acres to 80 acres at a price of $1.25. So the minimum amount of acres that you have to buy is getting less, and the price is also getting cheaper. A farmer could clear only about 10 to 12 acres of land in a year. And so if you think about how much land you're buying, a farmer that has 80 acres or whatever could only clear about 10 to 12 acres of land in a year. Speculators are going to buy a lot of this land, and they're going to chop it up into smaller segments and then sell it for higher prices. Remember, we talked about speculators before, and again, these speculators are not generally buying land with cash. They are taking out loans, they're getting loans, buying a lot of this land, and then hopefully selling it for a higher price. Indians, another reason why people are moving out west, Indians are no longer much of a problem, especially between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian, between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. And so we have many people moving out west. There's not a major fear of Indian attacks anymore. There are still Indians out there, but we're moving them further and further west all the time. Travel west is easier. We have a national road, which we're going to be talking about here in a few minutes. Part of Clay's American system. If you remember Henry Clay, he wanted a couple things. One of those things is this American system that is going to build internal improvements, paid for by the federal government. And this series of internal improvements, railroads and canals and bridges and roads, is all going to help this transportation out west. Again, one thing that we should remember are most of these roads and railroads and even canals are going to connect the north to the west. Very few of those are going to connect the south to the west or even the south to the north. The National Road is started in 1811. Proposed in 1807, started in 1811, and it goes from Baltimore, Maryland to what we know today as Wheeling, West Virginia. Back then there's not a West Virginia yet, but it goes from Baltimore to Wheeling, West Virginia, and eventually it carries throughout or into Illinois, so it goes further and further west. This is going to be a toll road. Sometimes you'll see it as a turnpike. Several years ago, they asked, on the AP exam, they asked a question about a turnpike, and they found that almost everybody on the east side of the Mississippi River, eastern part of the United States, got that question correct. They were used to that term, the turnpikes. Almost everybody west of the Mississippi River got that question wrong because they had no idea what turnpikes are. Turnpikes are just simply toll roads. Most of you know what toll roads are. You get on the road, you have to pay a certain amount for traveling on that road. Usually those roads are very good roads, and they're fast. And what we're going to see with this national road is not only does it make transportation easier and faster going east to west, west to east, but also we are going to start to see hotels pop up. We're going to start to see taverns pop up. We're going to start to see services pop up on this road, just like what we have today. President Jefferson actually questioned the constitutionality of having a national road because it doesn't. First of all, it's not in the Constitution. Remember, he's a strict constructionist, but also it's going to add to the national debt by building this road. Now, it's eventually going to pay itself off. But finally, and most importantly, is it doesn't help the entire country. It helps the north, it helps the west, but it doesn't help the south at all. A lot of times, this national road is also called the Cumberland Road. So you might see both of those terms. All right. Once you moved west, usually what you're going to do is you are going to leave in the early spring. Hopefully most of the spring rains are done, and most of the roads, once you get off the national road, they're no longer muddy. They're pretty easy to travel on. Once you get out to wherever your land is, wherever you bought land, maybe it's in Indiana, maybe it's in West Kentucky. Once you get out there, chances are you are alone. You get out there, you build a cabin, you build some sort of shelter. You have to clear or cut down enough trees for your clearing. And a lot of times, not the cutting down trees that's an issue, it's the digging of the stumps. And so that's why in a lot of these places, it's very, very difficult to move out there and to clear a large amount of land in a short amount of time. It's a very rough existence, very lonely, very poor. A lot of times, well, most of the times, very dirty. Diseases are common. And remember, doctors are very uncommon in the West. And so, if you have some sort of disease, if you hurt yourself at all, it's up to you to figure out how to overcome that. If you're lucky, though, you're going to go out west with a group, and for the most part, you're going to try to develop an area as a group. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to see your neighbors very often, but you know your neighbors are out there someplace, and within a day's ride, you can go and talk to your neighbors in case something happens. For the most part, though, it's you and your family, and that is it. And it's up to your family, you and your family, to make things work out. In the South is really transformed starting in 1793 by a guy named Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney graduated from Yale. He was very mechanical. He basically got an engineering degree. It wasn't called an engineering degree back then, but for the most part, he was good with his hands. He could fix things. He could create things, and one of the big things that he's going to create is called the cotton gin, and the cotton gin is going to transform the South. He heard that if somebody could figure out a way to clean cotton we'll talk about that here in just a second, if somebody could figure out a way to clean cotton easily, that it would bring the South out of poverty. By this time, we've been talking about tobacco in most of the South, especially in the plantation areas along the Tidewater region. A lot of tobacco, but very, very few people are actually making a lot of money on it. Most of these people are poor. They're Piedmont squatters. They're yeoman farmers, own a little piece of land, and just kind of eking out a living. Well, one of the crops that people are starting to grow, because it grows so well in the Southeast, is cotton. Now, I had a student several years ago bring in some raw cotton. And this is kind of what it looks like. It comes on a plant and it grows fairly low to the ground. And the problem with this, though, and I realize, the problem with this is that in this cotton there are seeds, and you have to tear apart the cotton in order to get these seeds out. And it is a very difficult thing to do. There's a seed, and it took me just a little bit to get the seed. There are lots of seeds in this cotton, and so it's like tearing apart cotton balls in order to try to get the seeds out. You have to get the seeds out in order to be able to spin this into thread, and then eventually make clothing out of it. And so the question is, how do we clean this cotton faster? Because right now, cotton farms are limited to the amount of cotton that you can clean, not how much cotton you can grow, but how much cotton can you clean. And so if you were a slave in the South back then, and your owner was growing cotton, your job for the most part was to sit on a porch, probably in the shade someplace, and to clean cotton. One slave could clean about 1 pound of cotton in a day. And it was very, very labor intensive. You could not clean a whole lot of cotton in a day, and it just took a lot of time. Not very difficult work. You could sit in the shade, and it's not a very difficult job. With the cotton gin, once Eli Windy creates this cotton gin, and it kind of looks like a box about this big. It has a crank on the side, and you put the cotton in the top, and you would crank it through. Well, there's a drum inside that has little teeth, and these teeth, as the cotton goes through, these teeth will tear apart the cotton fibers and then spit out the seeds in the bottom. And that way, then, as the cotton goes through, then it's all cleaned up, and you can package it up and send it on to somebody else who's going to spin it into thread. Well, with the cotton gin, with just a simple cotton gin, it now took a slave. One slave could clean 1,000 pounds of cotton in a day. So instead of cleaning 1 pound of cotton in a day, now one slave can clean 1,000 pounds of cotton in a single day. What this means is a couple things. First of all, obviously it's much much easier to make a lot of money on cotton. You can have these huge cotton plantations, because now your plantation is not, your plantation is not limited by how much cotton you can clean. It's limited by how much cotton you can grow. And so now all of a sudden in fact, a lot of places are plowing under their tobacco and now growing cotton. What this also means is this is bad news for slaves. A lot of people think, hey, cool, this is a time-saving, a labor-saving device for slaves. What this means for slaves is that instead of sitting on a porch picking out seeds in cotton, which is a relatively easy job to do, now your job gets much, much more difficult. Now you need fewer slaves to actually clean the cotton, and you need a lot more slaves to grow the cotton, and especially to pick the cotton. And remember, this is backbreaking work. This is in the South, and the prime cotton season, of course, is during the summer. It's very hot, it's very humid, and you are constantly bending down. Remember, the cotton is not up here, so you're constantly bending down, and you're tending to the cotton plants, or you're picking cotton all day long. It's a very, very, very difficult life. Okay, as we start moving further and further west, we are starting to see people actually move all the way to what's called the Far West. The Far West is in California, which I can do it right, obviously right there. Up until the 1800s, very little interest in the Far West, but of course with Lewis and Clark and their trip to the Far West to California, and then back again, actually to Oregon, and then back again, it opens up interest in the Far West. most of the people moving out to the far west are these incredibly independent types. They are mainly, a lot of them are fur trappers. Most of the animals in the east, especially east of the Appalachian Mountains, have been killed off, and of course the number one animal that everybody's looking for is still beaver skins or beavers, and then obviously using beaver skins for all sorts of different things. Well, if there are no more beavers in the east, you got to look for them someplace else, and that someplace else is going to be in the west. John Jacob Astor. Before 1812, John Jacob Astor had established a trading post at the mouth of the Columbia River in what we know today as Washington. He sets up the American fur industry, and with the war and with some of the economic issues with the war, he closes down that fur trapping, that American Fur Company, and sold his interest to the British. Now, the British are going to, both the British and the Americans are going to have a significant claim on the Oregon Territory. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. By 1822, two brothers start the Rocky Mountain Fur Company in Colorado. Andrew and William Ashley, the Rocky Mountain Fur Company in Colorado. And this is encouraging more and more people to move out west, especially men, to move out west and to trap animals. These people, these fur trappers, are often called mountain men. And these mountain men are important for a couple of reasons. First of all, they're making some money by trapping animals. These people are incredibly individualistic. These people are, for the most part, living on their own and living in the middle of nowhere. They're constantly dealing with not only living by themselves, but dangers such as we have Indians out there, we have wild animals out there. There are several instances where these fur trappers are attacked by bears or lions or mountain lions. And so it's a very, very dangerous thing to be doing, is living out there by yourself. A lot of times you'll see, especially if you'll see a picture of mountain men, these fur trappers, you'll see them wearing leather coats, leather pants, and a lot of times you'll see these fringes, these leather fringes on their coats. Well, these leather fringes were there for a couple of reasons. It is not just decoration. What they would do oftentimes, if they cut themselves or they need, something to tie, if you cut your finger, if you cut your arm, whatever, they would tie several of these fringes together and then wrap it around their arm, wrap it around their leg, whatever is bleeding, and use it almost as a tourniquet. Another thing that these people would do with these fringes is sometimes you get really super hungry, and so you're going to tear off several of these, dump it in some water, boil it up, and call it soup. And so these fringes on these jackets were there for a reason. Every once in a while, about once a year, these mountain men would get together. Now remember, these mountain men are living by themselves almost the entire year long. And so every once in a while, about every year and a half or so, these mountain men would get together, what they would call a rendezvous. And these mountain men rendezvous were wild, wild things. If you can imagine men living by themselves out in the middle of nowhere and only with themselves to talk to, and all of a sudden you're put together in this group of people. They had several competitions. A lot of these competitions were knife throwing or axe throwing, or one of my favorite competitions that they did was it was called Feed Fair, where you would have two mountain men several feet apart and 30 feet of intestines, of animal intestines in front of you, and each person would start eating these intestines. And the first person to the middle, they would tie a string in the middle. The first person to that string could take the intestines and rip it out of the person that they're competing against. And so that was, great fun. Lots of gambling going on. And remember, these mountain men don't have money really to gamble with. And so they're gambling with oftentimes food that they have, oftentimes supplies, what they have. Sometimes they would gamble with their women. So if you were married to a mountain man, it was very, very possible that you would be lost to somebody else because your husband had gambled you away. Now, not very many women, of course, are out in the West, but So that's why women are of course very, very valuable in the West. Food. These mountain men, especially at these rendezvous, were eating bison brains, unborn bison fetuses. They would empty the content of animal bladders on their food, and call those condiments, and then Rocky Mountain oysters. If you do not know what Rocky Mountain oysters are, I'll let you talk to somebody else or look that up yourself. Okay. Fur trappers operated in the Rocky Mountains from about 1820 to about 1840, so only about 20 years. Now, these people are going to be very, very important because not only are they trapping animals and making money that way, but what they are doing is they are mapping out these areas, and because they need to know where they're going and where they've been and what the terrain is and stuff. So they're not really mapping it out for anybody else, but for their own use. Well, eventually other people get their hands on these maps, and it becomes very, very useful as people start to move west. Between that time period, there were about 500 trappers in the Rocky Mountain region. Some became scouts later on when we get to the 1840s and people started moving west. Some people became scouts for these wagon trains, made money doing that. Like Jim Bridger, and we have Bridger Street here, and we have Bridger Middle School, and we have a lot of things named after Jim Bridger. A lot of people like Jim Bridger establishes trading posts, and so as people are moving out west, this is the way that these trading post operators are making some money. They are selling stuff to these pioneers as they are moving west. Well, as we are moving west and as we are moving south, one of the major issues still are Native Americans, are Indians. And of course, whites are not real excited about moving into areas that have Native Americans in them. President Jack, by the time we get to the late 1820s, early 1830s, now it's President Jackson, and President Jackson is not going to be known for his love of the Indians. And so President Jackson believed that all the Indians should be moved from the east, especially the southeast, to the west someplace. We need to find some land to move these Indians to, so we can open up this good land, especially in Georgia and Mississippi and Alabama, and move these Indians further west, ideally onto some land that is not very good. By the time Jackson arrives at the White House in 1829, a lot of the Indians, most of the Indians had been moved from the southeast to the west, but there are actually a few Indians that have not been moved, and Jackson is going to move them. Pause on that story for a second. From 1831 to 1832, we have another issue, especially in Illinois. In Illinois, there are two groups of Indians called the Sac Indians, S-A-C, and the Fox Indians, just like it spells, or just like it sounds, F-O-X. The Sac and the Fox Indians, by treaty, had been moved west of the Mississippi River into Iowa. Well, the Sac and Fox Indians found that life outside of their land was pretty difficult, and so a lot of these people started to move back east of the Mississippi River into their lands that they once owned. The leader of these Indians is called Black Hawk, and what's going to evolve from this is called the Black Hawk Wars. Well, as these Sac and Fox Indians are moving back east, we have already moved some whites in, and these whites are not real thrilled about Indians moving back into this land that the whites now own. Well, this sparks off what's called the Black Hawk War, and really the Black Hawk War is whites trying to push the Indians back west. For the most part, they're successful, but there are some conflicts that happened in this war between in 1832. 1,000 of them are by 1832. 1,000 of these Indians had moved east of the Mississippi River again, and now we're going to try to get them back. A couple of the major players in the Black Hawk War, first of all, Jefferson Davis, who's going to wind up as president of the Confederacy during the Civil War, and Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was a captain in the Illinois militia. Now, Lincoln doesn't see any action in the Black Hawk Wars, but he is part of the military and part of his campaign to move the Indians back west of the Mississippi River. By the time they clear east of the Mississippi River, hundreds of these Black Hawk or these Indians have been slaughtered. Okay, moving back down into the southeast, into Georgia, into Mississippi, and Alabama, and into Florida, we have what's called the 5 civilized tribes. The 5 civilized tribes are called that because of the Indians that we've encountered so far. These tribes are they are living their lives the most like whites than any other tribes. The 5 civilized tribes, and make sure you know these please, are the Cherokee, the Creek, C-R-E-E-K, the Seminole Indians, they're in Florida, S-E-M-I-N-O-L-E, like the Florida State Seminoles, the Chickasaw, C-H-I-C-K-A-S-A-W, and the Choctaw, C-H-O-C-T-A-W. Most of these Native Americans are agricultural. Most of them are successful. Most of them are running their lives very, very similar to what the whites are doing. The Cherokees, more so than the other 4 tribes. The Cherokees actually live in towns. Many of them are wearing Western clothes. Many of them are sending their kids to school. They have their own language. Again, the Cherokees have their own language, their own alphabet. And so the Cherokee Indians are, for the most part, living their lives much like whites. Their problem is they are sitting on very, very valuable land. And we start to see a lot of these things mesh together. As we have Eli Whitney's cotton gin, we need more land to grow cotton. Well, where is a great place to grow cotton? Mainly in the southeast, into North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, into Texas. Remember, we don't own Texas yet, but that's coming. Spoiler alert. The first tribe to be moved were the Choctaws in 1830 to 32, the Creeks in Alabama from 33 to 36, and the Chickasaw then from 33 also to 36. And they are being moved. The government sits around, or the government thought, okay, where can we move these Native Americans where whites don't want to go? All right, and the idea is now the real reason that we want to move these Indians is, of course, they're sitting on valuable land. But the government argues if we don't move these Indians, there's going to be conflicts, and these Indians are going to be killed. So we're actually doing the humane thing by moving them into someplace that's safe. And so what we're going to do with a lot of these, or most of these Native Americans in the southeast, we are going to move them to the most desolate place that we can find, Oklahoma. And so we have these Indian tribes being moved to Oklahoma. Even today, Oklahoma has a lot of, or several Indian reservations in that state. Well, the reason why we're moving it to Oklahoma is because Oklahoma does not have very good land. In fact, it has horrible land for growing anything. In fact, in some places in Oklahoma back then, there were pools of it just laying on the ground, pools of this black sticky stuff. Well, this black sticky stuff was oil, and Oklahoma has lots and lots and lots of oil. Well, as soon as we find out a reason to use oil, we're going to move the Indians again out of Oklahoma, and this time we're going to find even a more desolate place. We're going to make sure that nothing's there, and we are going to move them to New Mexico. So where, again, there are many today Indian reservations, Native American reservations. All right, well, let's get back to the Cherokees. Cherokees realized pretty quickly that there was going to be no stopping the Americans and the American military from moving them out. So to prove how American they are, they did the most American thing that you can do when you have an issue with somebody. They sued somebody. And so in the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, this is 1831, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the Cherokees were called domestic dependents or wards of the government. And as wards of the government, the Supreme Court said that the Cherokees had the right to their land until they voluntarily gave it up or they sold it. And so that was the Cherokee land, and nobody could take it from them. Not even the federal government could take it from them without their permission. Keyword is without their permission. In 1832, Worcester versus Georgia essentially says the same thing, but it said that even the people of Georgia could not enter into Cherokee land. This is an independent state for the Cherokee Indians. Well, the president at the time, President was Andrew Jackson. He is not happy by this. Now, Andrew Jackson is going to, during the War of 1812, if you remember, Andrew Jackson conducted his own illegal war, most people would call it, against the Native Americans during this War of 1812. Well, he's going to carry that on as president. And so Andrew Jackson said, basically, I'm going to move them anyway. I don't care what the Supreme Court says. I don't care what Chief Justice Marshall says. I am going to move them anyway. His quote is, John Marshall, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Oh, sorry, I screwed that up. So John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Basically, what Jackson is saying is John Marshall has made this decision, but he has no power to back it up. As president, Jackson had the power to send the military wherever he wanted to, and he's going to send the military into the South, into Georgia, and forcibly move these Cherokees out. Well, in 1835, the government found a small group of Cherokees that were not representative of the Cherokee Nation. Cherokees did not select this group of Indians to represent them. Well, the government found this group of Indians and said, listen, we will give you lots of money if you sign this treaty. The treaty is called the Treaty of New Echota, E-C-H-O-T-A. And basically what it did was it sold the United States government the Cherokee land for $5.6 million. Now remember, this small group of Native Americans are going to make a lot of money doing this, but the entire Cherokee Nation is going to be moved out of Georgia. All of this happened, or most of the move happens in the winter of 1838. There are about 16,000 Cherokee Indians moving from Georgia into Oklahoma, and it's basically a forced march. Whatever you could bring, whatever you could carry with you, and that was all. And so, as they're marching from Georgia into Oklahoma, it's very cold. They're crossing some rivers. A lot of people die of hypothermia. A lot of people die of disease. And the Indians are going to call this trek the trail where they cried. We know it as the Trail of Tears. About 25%, so about 4,000 Native Americans died on this trail of what we know today as the Trail of Tears. The Seminole Indians are the last of the 5 civilized tribes, and they tried a different solution in order to not have to move. Now, most of the Seminole Indians moved to Oklahoma, but there was a small group of Seminole Indians led by Chief Osceola, O-S-C-E-O-L-A. Chief Osceola is going to lead this small group of basically Seminole warriors into the Everglades. Now, the Everglades is a huge, huge, huge swamp. And what they are going to do is they are going to conduct guerrilla warfare against the United States government and the United States Army. Jackson sent the United States military into Florida, into the Everglades, in order to find Chief Osceola and the Seminole Indians. And the military was never able to find him. And so the military had to try to figure out a way to capture, especially Chief Osceola. They figured that once we capture him, then the rest of then his followers are going to surrender as well. And so the United States military waved a white flag. And under this now remember what a white flag means. It does not necessarily mean we surrender, although it could mean that. What it really means is ceasefire. We are going to cease fire, let's talk, and then once we are done talking, if you choose to surrender, terrific. If you choose to go back fighting, we'll let you go back and continue fighting. Well, so under this white flag, Chief Osceola comes out, and he is captured by the United States military. Once he's captured by the United States military, he's put in prison, and shortly after that, he dies of disease. In the end, the government spent $20 million to find the Seminole Indians in Florida. Now remember, we spent a total of about $15 million for all of the Louisiana Territory. So $20 million, and it cost 1,500 American soldiers. 1,500 American soldiers were killed in trying to find these Seminole Indians. In the end, we did not find them. The Seminole Indians hid out, conducted their guerrilla warfare, and in the end, the United States government decided this was not worth it, and we wound up building up around Florida, but we were never able to totally capture all the Seminole Indians. In the end, all the tribes between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River are going to give up. They're going to what's called cede, C-E-D-E, or C-E-E-D, over 100 million acres of land to the government. In exchange, they're going to get about 68 million acres, or I'm sorry, $68 million for this 100 million acres. So if you figure out the price per acre, that's much less than $1 per acre. Okay, and they're also going to receive 32 million acres in badland west of the Mississippi River, mainly in Oklahoma. All right, getting back to the American system and Henry Clay. Henry Clay, this is very, very important. Henry Clay is from Kentucky. Kentucky back then is considered the West. Obviously not the far West, but considered the West. And so he is on the frontier, and now he is a senator. He's a senator from Kentucky. And he says a couple things. First of all, we need to have this American system. We need to develop infrastructure in the United States. And we're going to pay for this by raising tariffs, raising the price on incoming goods. Now remember, this is going to help mainly New England merchants and New England factories, mainly New England factories that are going to be producing stuff, and those goods are going to be protected against cheaper European goods. This does not help poor people for the most part, especially in the South and in the West, but especially in the South, because Southerners are going to get no benefit or very little benefit from the American system. They're going to not get any roads, they're not going to get any canals, they're not going to get any railroads, and so these tariffs are going to be raised, and it's going to, for the South, it's going to cost more to buy these goods. So they see it as a tax, but they're not going to get any benefit. The West, even though they're for the most part poor, and they're also going to have to pay these taxes, at least the West is getting the benefit from the American system, from improving our internal structure. Okay, all of this is going to lead to the Panic of 1819. Panic of 1819 is going to be the first of 5 panics. And when you think about these panics, these economic crises, they all happen for a reason. They all happen for the same reason. That same reason is over-speculation. Now, it's over-speculation on different items, but it's usually over-speculation, or it's always over-speculation on something. In other words, we're buying, hoping that someday we're going to sell that for a higher price. Well, we buy, and we don't have the money for it, and so we are taking out loans. And remember, this is the way that banks are going to make money, is by giving out loans and then taking these loans back in and getting interest on these loans. Coming up to during the War of 1812, from 1793 to 1812, for the most part, farm prices were pretty good because during wars, farmers always do fairly well. They're able to sell their crops, sell the crops, and people are making money even during the war. And as they make money, they want to buy more things. These internal improvements are creating land booms. We've already talked about the land acts of different years, and so more and more people want to buy land, and they don't have the money to buy land, and so they are taking on loans. We already talked about 1815, 1 million acres sold. 1819, 5 million acres are sold. 5 million acres of land are sold, mostly on credit, mostly by people borrowing money. Now remember, the National Bank the charter of the National Bank had run out in 1811, and so that we did not have a new National Bank until 1817. Well, who's taken the place of this National Bank? It's going to be these state banks, and back then these state banks are going to be called wildcat banks. So these wildcat banks, especially in the West, are providing easy credit for people to be able to buy land. If you make it difficult for people to get loans, then people are not going to borrow money, and that's of course the way that your bank is going to make money. Well, by 1817, now we have a national bank, And now we have the national bank competing with these state banks. And so the interest rate even gets lower and lower and lower, which encourages more and more people to take out loans and to buy more land, probably with money that they cannot pay back, or these loans that they cannot pay back. Well, these state banks, to make it even easier to buy land, they are issuing what's called bank notes. These individual state bank notes. And so what you would do is you would buy this land and you would sign this note, and the bank would hold that note. And then when you paid off your loan, the bank would rip up that note. And so there are all these state bank notes out there that are really not backed by anything. That is not backed by gold. It's not backed by silver, also known as specie. And it's just these pieces of paper floating out there. Well, all of a sudden we have a new president of the National Bank, and this new president of the National Bank takes a look, and he decides, this is end of 1818, getting into 1819. This new president takes a look and says, our bank has given out lots of these loans, and these loans are not good loans. It's very likely that the people who have taken out these loans are not going to pay us back. And so we need to call back in these loans and get our money back right now. Well, if you cannot pay back your loan, then all of a sudden you lose your land. And guess who owns the land now? The banks own this land. But the banks don't want to own this land because they can't do anything with it. And then they can't sell it to anybody else because nobody has money. All of this leads into a 6-year depression. And whenever we have a depression, whenever the economy goes down, all of a sudden people don't have money. If you do have money, you're going to hold on to that money. You are not going to spend that money. And so now these factories are producing things and nobody's buying it, and you have an oversurplus of whatever you're making, mainly textiles in the Northeast. Nobody's buying those textiles. Nobody's buying anything. And so people are getting laid off of work, getting fired from their jobs, and more people have less money. It just makes the issue worse. Well, by 1820, things are so bad that that the banks beg Congress to do something about it, and Congress passes the Relief Act of 1821. Pay attention to this, because in our next panic, they're going to say, well, why can't we just do another Relief Act like 1821? And so Congress responds with this Relief Act of 1821, basically extending the amount of time you have to pay off any loans, especially for land, allowing people to stay on their land and keep paying their loans back at a lower rate. Okay, so again, over speculation on something. We have these speculators, especially, who are buying up all this land, and then all of a sudden the economy crashes. They can't pay back these loans. Then the banks have all this land. And transportation revolution is going to be very, very important as we get more and more industrialized, because we need to not only be able to bring raw materials to the place of manufacturing, but then also take that manufactured goods and send it someplace to be shipped off. In 1712, an Englishman, a guy named Thomas Newcomen, came up with the idea of a steam engine, and the first steam engine was used to pump out water from mines. You dig mines, and invariably they would fill up with water, and so you need to get that water out of the mine so you can keep digging. By the early 1800s, a guy named James Watt is going to take this idea of the steam engine and incorporate that into factories. So now, instead of your factories needed to be right along rivers, now you can move your factories anywhere you want to, and you can buy cheap land, and you can put your factory there instead of having to buy very, very expensive land along a river. And then instead of having all these factories along a river and anybody upstream is going to affect your factory, now your factory is not dependent on anybody else or what they do. So James Watt, very, very important person as far as industrializing America. Robert Fulton is another big name here. He is going to develop a steam engine and put it on a boat. So instead of having a sailing ship, we are going to have steamships. And of course, these steamships can travel wherever, and it's not going to be dependent upon the weather. And so having these steam engines on boats. Now, there's going to be an issue with especially the early steamboats. And when we think about steamboats, a lot of times the picture that we get are these paddle boats going up and down the Mississippi River. And a lot of times these paddle boats, the pressure of these steam engines is going to be so great that you're going to see explosions, and you're going to see a lot of people being killed because of these steam engines on these boats, or these steamboats going up and down the Mississippi River. However, it does make transportation faster, especially up and down rivers. So instead of just floating down the river and then having to what's called draw your boat back upriver, or in many cases you would float downriver and disassemble your boat and sell the scrap lumber to somebody, and then walk back up to wherever you started. Now you have a steamboat that obviously can go up and down the river. The first steamboat in the West was introduced by Nicholas Roosevelt. He is an ancestor of Teddy Roosevelt, and he sailed from New Orleans, from Pittsburgh down to New Orleans, and all up and down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Okay, turnpikes. We talked about turnpikes earlier, also known as toll roads. These are roads that you pay for. These are roads that are going to be built to transport not only people but goods and goods up and down the road. And even though you are paying for this road, it's important because it's going to dramatically lower the shipping costs. Instead of having to haul things over the Appalachian Mountains or haul things from east to west on unpaved roads, now you have these good roads, and you can travel much, much faster on these roads. The first one is called the major one is called the National Road, begun in 1811. Also known as the Cumberland Road. We talked about that before, from Maryland to West Virginia. And eventually it's going to, I don't have my map down now, but eventually it's going to make its way all the way to Illinois. Again, tying the North with the West. Not necessarily tying the North with the South, but tying the North with the West. All right, canals. In the 1820s and 1830s, we are going to start building canals. The biggest canal, the most important canal, is going to be called the Erie Canal. And we'll get to that here in just a second. So instead of, again, what we are going to be doing is lowering the cost of transportation and making that transportation much, much faster. So instead of hauling goods over the Appalachian Mountains, 4 horses could pull 1 ton of goods just 12 miles a day. Now with a canal, 4 horses could draw a boatload of 100 tons 24 miles in a day. And so you're being able to transport a lot more goods over a longer period over a greater distance per day. And so it's going to dramatically decrease the price of goods. The Erie Canal is going to be started July 4th, 1817. And in this case, July 4th is not a coincidence. Whenever you have this major project that you want people to invest in, a great time to start that project is July 4th, because everybody's patriotic, everybody wants to get involved in what America's doing, and so you get a lot of investors that will participate in this way if you start your project on July 4th. And so the distance between the Hudson River and Lake Erie. So paying attention to our map. Paying attention to our map. Here's New York. Here's the Hudson River. The Hudson River goes out into the Atlantic, up the port of New York, and the Hudson River really connects to Lake Champlain. So Hudson River goes north and south. The Erie Canal will go from Lake Erie, thus the Erie Canal, and be built eastward, where it will match up with the Hudson River, 350 miles across the state of New York. And by doing this, what we're doing is we are connecting, again, east to west. Now, if you are a farmer in Ohio, in Indiana, you get your goods on Lake Michigan, send it through the Great Lakes, hook up with the Erie Canal, and it's much, much faster, actually much safer to do it that way than traveling over the Appalachian Mountains, and much cheaper to do it that way as well. The Erie Canal is finished in 1825, so it takes 8 years to build the Erie Canal, so 1825 is when it's finally finished. So you think about 1825, and that's when the Erie Canal is finally finished. 350 miles, like I said before. Now, instead of costing $100 to transport goods from Buffalo to New York City, now it costs $5 to transport the same amount of goods from the Erie Canal, or from Buffalo. Buffalo, by the way, western New York, to to New York City. So, and it takes 6 days instead of 20 days to transport those goods. So again, greatly reducing the cost of shipping. It reduced the shipping cost from about 20 to 30 cents a ton down to 2 to 3 cents a ton. The canal itself was about 4 feet deep, but about 40 feet wide. And what would happen is you would have a very, very intricate drawing of the Erie Canal. You would have the canal, once the canal was built, you would have paths on either side of the canal. And these paths are where your horses would walk. And so I'm going to draw a horse here. It kind of looks like a spider, but it's a horse. And so you would have your 4 horses on the canal. And these 4 horses then would be attached to your barge, and it would pull your barge either up or down the Erie Canal. And so in one direction you would go this way, and on the other side you would go this way, and you would have your horses. You would have your horses over here pulling this barge, and so for 350 miles. Again, much faster to do it that way. I'm sure my drawing cleared everything up for you. Railroads. Railroads eventually proved to be the fastest and the cheapest and the easiest means of transportation. And not only once it's built, but it's also probably the easiest form of transportation to construct, as long as you don't have to blast through mountains and go across rivers. But even going across rivers is a lot easier than digging this Erie Canal. The B&O, by the way, going back to the Erie Canal, the Erie Canal is going to compete with toll roads that are essentially going the same direction. So the National Road going from east to west, west to east, and the Erie Canal is essentially doing the same thing, connecting the west to the east at a much cheaper price than what you could send goods on with the National Road. Railroads, like I said, proved to be the fastest, most reliable, the cheapest form of transportation. Originally, trains were originally conducted in England, started in England. Eventually, they come over here by 1825 over the United States. The first railroad was built between Baltimore and Ohio. Started again on July 4th, 1828. And we talked about why you want to start projects on July 4th. Well, again, we're going to start the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, or the B&O Railroad, on July 4th, 1828. 2 years later, they open up the first 13-mile stretch, and it becomes so popular that obviously they're going to expand that from there. And again, if you pay attention, Baltimore, what else did we have starting in Baltimore? The National Road going out to Ohio, almost the same exact spot that the National Road is in. And so the railroad is going to compete with not only the National Road, but also the Erie Canal to bring goods and services back and forth from east to west. Again, none of this stuff is going from north to south. It's all going from east to west. By 1836, there was a total of about 1,000 miles of track laid throughout the United States. And by 1860, there were 30,000 miles of track. Now, AP will never give you a date. That's not important. So 1860 is right before the Civil War. And when we talk about 30,000 miles of track, about 75% of that is going to be located in the North. One of the major reasons why the North is going to win the Civil War is because of the ease of transporting soldiers and products back and war goods back and forth to where they need them. And so the railroad is going to play a major role in the upcoming Civil War. Okay, all of this is going to result in the growth of cities, because as we are shipping more and more goods out to the west, we're also shipping more and more goods back east, and more people are, if you experience one of these panics that we talked about in 1819, later on 1830s, and so if you lose your farm, then you're going to wind up in the cities looking for a job, and so it's going to result in growth of cities. Cities were defined by 1820 as having at least 8,000 people. And as a whole, cities are growing faster than any other part of the country. And so these even though the majority of Americans are still living in rural areas, cities are starting to explode and cities are starting to grow faster than any other place in the country. In 1790, right after the Constitution was signed, 1 person out of 30 lived in a city, and by 1840, 1 person out of 12 lived in a city. And so, again, more and more people are moving to these cities. By 1810, New York City was the largest city in the country. For a couple of reasons. First of all, it has the best port on the Atlantic seaboard, even better than Philadelphia and Boston. And so a lot of goods are going to go through the port of New York. But also because by the time we get to 1810 and especially the 1820s, mid-1820s we have or late 1820s we have the Erie Canal built, and all those products coming from the west are now ending up in New York City. New York City is also the spot where England is going to dump a lot of their cheap goods. And so as England is sending over stuff, almost all of it winds up in New York City and then spread throughout the country, being sold throughout the country. Businesses are an expansion of all of this, or is dependent upon all this transportation revolution that we talked about before. As the population grows, we have more workers for factories, we have more workers for businesses, there's improvements in transportation. So now if you go out west, if you go out west, there's very little hope that you're ever going to go back east. But now especially with the railroad reaching the near west, if you want to call it that, there is hope that if things don't work out, you can make it back to where your family is in a lot of these eastern cities. Business growth is also because of the imagination of many of these business owners. And a couple examples of this. First of all, the whaling industry. Whaling was a big industry in the early 1800s, even through the late 1800s, mainly because, we were going to use whales for several different things. Whale oil is going to be used for candles and cosmetics and ointments and perfumes. Whale oil also for lamps. And so as you're walking up and down the street, that whale oil or those lamps are not being lit by kerosene yet. It's all because of whale oil. So we are going to hunt whales by the thousands in the Atlantic. Eventually, we're going to run out of whales in the Atlantic. They're going to become less prevalent, and so we're going to need to hunt whales in the Pacific as well. The heyday of whaling in the Atlantic was right around the 1830s. It's a very dangerous occupation. You are essentially hunting whales in boats about half the size of a whale. You can't have these huge ships chasing after whales. You need something much smaller and much more maneuverable. Whale bones are also used for corsets. If you know what corsets are, they're basically girdles. And so you would have these whale bones and then strapped in this cloth, this fabric, and then somebody would get behind when you put it on a woman, somebody would get behind, put their foot in the middle of her back, and then tighten up the laces as tight as you can, making a woman's waist very small. No kidding, probably about that big. So another industry which is kind of interesting actually and shows the imagination of business owners, especially back then, was the ice industry. We take ice for granted. You go to the refrigerator and you want a cold glass of water, and you get some ice out of the refrigerator, or you have a little thing in the door, and you don't even think about it, and your refrigerator automatically makes ice. Well, back then, obviously, refrigerators are not around. You're not automatically making ice. The only way to make ice is actually to have it freeze outside. You need to have a very cold climate in order to be able to have enough ice. A little personal story. My mother's family back in the early 1900s moved to northern Minnesota from North Dakota, and they owned a resort. Well, at this resort, they were on a lake, and during the winter, because there's nobody at the resort during the winter, one of the major jobs that they did was to go out of the lake and cut big chunks of ice and then bring them off the lake and put them in what's called the ice house. The ice house was built underground, and so you'd have all this ice in this ice house, and then during the summer, you'd open up the ice house and take out a chunk of ice, chip it up, and then put all that ice into ice boxes for all the different cabins at the resort. Well, essentially that's the same thing that's going on in America in the 1830s, 1820s, and 1830s is if you're in Georgia, you never get ice unless it is shipped to you. And so shipping ice becomes a major industry. And not only shipping ice into southern plantations and southern states, but also shipping ice worldwide. We shipped ice all the way to India on a regular basis. And the idea is if you can make it to India with about half of your ice left, it would be profitable for you to do that. So hopefully it doesn't melt. It doesn't all melt by the time you get to India. Also, another thing helping businesses are these general incorporation laws. So, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but this idea of creating a corporation, and so your personal finances, if you are starting a corporation, your personal finances are not attached to this corporation. That the corporation succeeds or doesn't succeed on its own and is not dependent upon your personal finances. So that way, if the corporation goes under, if your business goes under, goes bankrupt, you are not personally bankrupt as well, which encourages a lot more people to actually invest in businesses and to start their own businesses and create jobs. We also start with this idea of shareholders in businesses. Back before shareholders, and the key word here is limited liability, if you were invested into a company, if you had bought stock into a company, you were part owner of that company. And that's still the same case as today. If you have stock in Apple, you are part owner of Apple. Now, if Apple makes money, great, you make money on your shares of stock. If Apple loses money, you lose the amount of money according to how many shares you own. If Apple Corporation goes bankrupt, nobody's going to come to your door and say, okay, Apple Corporation went bankrupt, they owe $50 million, you pay out. You are only liable, or you are limited in liability to how much you have invested. And so you can determine how much that liability is. Well, back before that, if you were invested a little bit, you were liable for the entire thing. With limited liability, it encourages more people to invest in businesses. It gives those businesses capital to be able to expand and to create jobs and to hire more people and make more product. Well, all of this is leading to the rise of the factory. Remember, we talked about Samuel Slater, 1791, Samuel Slater, that English guy that comes over, and it's because of him that we have our first textile factory in Rhode Island. Pretty quickly, the idea of textile factories spreads throughout the Northeast, especially in Massachusetts, and particularly in Lowell, Massachusetts, Lowell, small little town in Massachusetts. Early on in the 1790s and even into the early 1800s, these factory jobs were really good. Adults would get these jobs, and they were good paying jobs, and they were safe, and they were clean, and for the most part, they were really good jobs. Well, as time goes on and as machines get easier and easier to use, now all of a sudden you are hiring more and more women because you can pay them less than men, and you are hiring more and more children because you can pay them less than women. And now another reason why these women and children are being hired is because they tend to have very, very small hands. And so as machines are moving up and down and spinning around and stuff, and every once in a while those machines get stuck, women and children it's easier for them to get their hands in there to unstick whatever is stuck. Well, every once in a while, you unstick something, the machine goes, and you lose your hand. The good news is the companies would keep your job for you, and as soon as your hand grows back, you can get your job back. Okay. So now, because of Eli Whitney and the cotton gin in 1793, we're producing more cotton, we are producing more textiles, we have more textile factories, we need more workers, and we can pay women and children very, very little money to have these jobs. Oftentimes, mills would have children easily under the age of 12. They would work 6 days a week, and oftentimes would get into the factory before the sun rose and leave the factory after the sun set. So for 6 days a week, they would never, ever see the sun. And that's going to carry on for a long, long time. 1834 in Lowell, Massachusetts, we see our first what's called association, our first labor union, if you want to call it that. It's not on a national scale. In fact, it's very, very local. It's just localized to not only Lowell, Massachusetts, but also to a specific factory. And so these women upset because the factory is cutting their pay, but also raising the price of boarding, because you would have to stay in the boarding houses of the factories, and you would have to pay rent every month in order to stay there, in order to keep your job. And so when your rent went up and your pay went down, this of course meant less money for those women. Most of these women are young. Most of these women are single. 80% are unmarried. And so we start to see, especially in Lowell, Massachusetts, these women coming together and saying, listen, if I walk out the job, nothing's going to happen. But if all of us walk out the job, then the factory has to listen to us. And so this is the first type of labor union strikes that we're going to see, and this is happening in Lowell, Massachusetts. 1837, we are going to have another panic, and of course this leads to more people being laid off. Over speculation, we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. Over speculation, businesses go bankrupt, farms go bankrupt, more people are leaving the farm because they've lost their farm and flooding into the cities looking for jobs. And the more workers you have, the less money that they're going to make. You can pay workers less because they are willing to accept less pay for the same amount of work. 1845, a woman named Sarah Bagley created the first prominent labor association, labor union, called the Female Labor Reform Association. It not only made demands on factories, but it also asked for the legislature, for the federal legislature, to come up with some laws which will help with working conditions in these factories. Now, it didn't go very far early on, but this is the first step to major labor unions that we're going to see in the late 1800s and early 1900s. By the time we get to the mid-1800s, just before the Civil War, we are going to see an influx of a new group of people. Before, it was mainly English and some French and some German sprinkled in there. But by the time we get to 1845, most of the immigrants are going to be coming from Ireland. And we are going to have this massive influx of Irish coming into America. Now, the issue with the Irish coming into America is, of course, before the Irish, most people are Protestant. Well, the Irish are not Protestant. They are Catholic. And if you remember, Catholics and Protestants don't get along very well, and that certainly is going to be the case. As these Irish come into places like New York and Massachusetts looking for jobs, they are going to be willing to work for less than the people who are already there, Protestants who are already there. And so these Irish are going to be taking the jobs of these Protestant workers. In many cases, in these factories, the people in the factories already, these Protestants who have been around forever, are hanging signs in the factory that say, "No Irish need apply." And in other words, don't come to the factory, don't come and take our jobs. But the factory owners are going to love hiring the Irish because they're going to work for a lot less. Now, because they're working for a lot less, a lot of these Irish are going to live in slums. They don't have enough money to live in nice neighborhoods or nice houses. And pretty quickly, the phrase is going to be, because Irish are going to get involved in crime, Irish are going to get involved in prostitution, Catholics tend to drink, and all of this are symptoms of poverty. But because of all this, the phrase is going to be those dirty Catholics. And pretty quickly we're going to see this conflict between the Protestants and Catholics in North America. In fact, there's a really great movie called Gangs of New York that depicts this. I believe it's right at the beginning of the Civil War, or 1863, maybe in the middle of the Civil War. And this idea of Protestants and Catholics clashing in New York City, and sometimes very, very violently. By 1850, Lowell, Massachusetts is really a squalid slum. Lots of poor people in Lowell looking for jobs, most of them out of work. A lot of them living in poverty, doing whatever they can to survive. A lot of times this means gangs. A lot of times this means crime. A a lot of times in these depressed areas, it means high rate of alcoholism, and so things are not going well for these new immigrants coming into America. Okay, that is the end of chapter 9.